This is episode 151 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am thrilled this week to be joined by State Representative Jason Harper. First and foremost, Jason, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, a return guest, and happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for coming on the show this week.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be back. Love the foundation, and happy Thanksgiving to you as well.
And you, real quickly, you represent an area of Rio Rancho. Briefly describe your legislative district.
So I represent the northern Rio Rancho area. It's essentially Northern Meadows, Mariposa, Enchanted Hills, and part of kind of older Rainbow Rio Rancho area. So kind of the northern third. Okay.
And you're a Republican.
Yes.
So not too many of you around. I don't know if we can get you declared an endangered species yet. That would perhaps be helpful in preserving some of your numbers, but you are a Republican, the few, the proud.
That's right. And I don't know if anyone would want us to name us endangered species. Usually it's trying to kill an industry. You name something an endangered species. So
there you go. Well, I know the number one issue that we tend to talk about is the gross receipts tax. You are the legislature's de facto expert on that issue. We want to talk about that, of course. But before we get into the 2020 session and what you see coming down the pike, good, bad, and ugly, 2019 was a challenging session. And maybe you can summarize, if you will, some of the economic policies in particular that were addressed and where they took us in New Mexico.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And the 2019 session was really just a complete disaster on so many levels. First off, I've never seen so much ugliness, especially from our Speaker of the House. Brian Egolf is a progressive Democrat from Santa Fe, and it's just...
but you repeat yourself.
Yeah, right. But he just really let his true personality shine last session, and just it was very ugly. And there were a lot of bad things that happened economically. I'll just mention a few that really I think are terrible for New Mexico. The first is the budget. We increased spending by 12%, which is shocking. I went back in history, looked at the last 30 years, including growth and inflation. What is the safe percentage you can grow the state budget? And that number is 3.5%. And we raised it by 12. So that, and most of that money went to education. So in the future, when the bottom falls out of our economy, like oil and gas does, we're going to have to cut the budget. And where we're going to have to cut it? Teachers, K through 12 education. So that's going to be incredibly painful. Another one that just really rubbed me raw was the increases and changes to the film tax credit. It's not really a credit, it's a rebate. Every dollar they spend, you, the taxpayer, gives them 25 cents back if it's in urban New Mexico, or 35 cents if it's in rural New Mexico. And being very liberal, the most we get back from that dollar spent is about 18 cents in taxes. So we are totally subsidizing this industry. And just so everyone's aware, I'm an equal opportunity hater of all economic development credits. But if we were going to choose an industry for corporate welfare, I would want to choose one that is vested in New Mexico, that wants to be here and stay here and help grow New Mexico. But we know the second we take these credits away, the film industry's gone.
Yeah. And the Rio Grande Foundation, for example, had serious issues with the Facebook deal, which was negotiated by a Republican governor, had more than its share of subsidies, but to at least give that deal some credit, it's not going away. You know, Facebook has its facility and they can't easily pick up and move, whereas film definitely can.
That's right. Yeah. When Facebook is all built out, there'll be 6 buildings that each can fit an aircraft carrier inside it. And of course, there's going to be maintenance and all those ancillary jobs that aren't construction that remain. So yeah, we at least got something out of that.
Right. So, you talk about the film and the spending, and I know that, we also had concerns about the minimum wage, which I think you share. Let's see.
Yeah, I mean,
there's so many other policies that happen, but nothing really. We can beat the dead horse of bad legislation. Did anything that you saw as really positive happen? I mean, one of the things, I guess let's talk about the tax increases. You've been working on this issue for a long time. You had a nice mix in your legislation that you put forth in the past of revenue increases that were kind of evening the playing field for different industries, and some revenue enhancements on, say, the lab in Los Alamos. But you also had broad-based cuts and reform to the gross receipts tax. But they went ahead and took all the sugar off the top and didn't actually do any of the reform. So talk about the tax increase bill, HB 6, that passed last session.
Yeah, it was really disappointing to see a lot of my hard work and a lot of hard work of other people kind of been taken and wrapped around some bad tax policy and then call that good tax reform is what they basically did. So yeah, there were several things that I think were good for New Mexico. The internet sales tax, I know I hate paying it, but it really is kind of a level the playing field and helping your mom and pop shops here. Like I spoke with the owner of Kurt's Camera Corral, used to have a shop here, and he said that he had people coming into his store, handling his cameras, talking to him, about the features, and then he saw them walk out of the store and buy it on Amazon before they'd even left the store on their phones, right? And so it's just not fair for our local shops to have a 7-8% disadvantage immediately across, folks on the internet. So I really saw this as a fairness issue. But every tax bill that I crafted, any revenue that was generated by increasing a tax, we offset that by lowering the gross receipts tax. So it was revenue neutral, we call it, right? Whatever new tax revenue we get, we lower other taxes so that it's not extra dollars to the state. But House Bill 6 did not do that. All of the things that generated revenue, they just took. And it was really a net $500 million tax increase to New Mexico when you include the state and the local portions. And to me, that's just, it's incredible that we had $1 billion surplus and we still raised taxes, right? I mean, an extra $1 billion out of a $6 billion budget, I mean, that wasn't enough. We still had to raise taxes.
And yeah, the internet tax thing is one issue that we at the Rio Grande Foundation have some philosophical differences with Representative Harper over. And because it's complicated, because it was never a policy driven by Washington, D.C. or the states that they're going to specifically exempt online retailers or mail order, which is really where all the legislation and legal opinions came from.
That's right.
However, the Supreme Court did give the blessing to online sales taxation. We do have concerns that this nexus issue, which is ultimately what's at stake, is how do you tax somebody who has no direct relationship with the state that you are in? If you're Representative Harper suddenly, and this is all metaphorically speaking,
sure.
But he has a business that sells tchotchkes for New Mexico, say Christmas ornaments or something to people in other states. He's not really benefiting in any way from that state government, California or whatever, but then California could come after him under some of these revised, it's called nexus. It's all about the point of contact. And I think the Supreme Court has set up some dangerous ground for us. I understand the fairness issue, and that's not really our concern. Although, when you get the gross receipts tax going up so dramatically, it makes that fairness issue more of a problem. And I've not once heard in a committee any legislators say, if we raise this gross receipts tax up another quarter cent, our mom and pop retailers are not going to be able to compete with the online folks. They don't ever actually put their money where their mouths are when it comes to these kind of arguments. But we'll leave all that behind. I just can't let that little issue slip by, but it has kind of slipped by at this point. Well, since we're talking gross receipts tax, we're talking what was left out in 2019, which was really any significant reform of the GRT. But Speaker Egolf has at least made some comments. The governor has proposed a task force or committee to address tax reform. Just getting to a total starting point here, do you see them as believing that the gross receipts tax is the problem, or is this all going to be just a Trojan horse for more tax increases down the road? Jason Harper.
So I think there's two things at play here, right? So the first is Speaker Egolf. I think he understands the gross receipts tax problem. He has a wife that's a small business owner. But let's just be completely honest here. He is a politician. He is trying to keep control of the House and keep his seat as Speaker. And this whole trying to do it right before an election, some gross receipts tax reform, is clearly his way of trying to give his vulnerable members cover for the terrible vote they made last year on House or in 2019 on House Bill 6. That was a terrible vote for them. And honestly, they had the numbers. He could have had his vulnerable members not vote or vote against it.
Right.
But they all voted as a block for it, and it just blew our minds. So they're going to get hammered raising taxes on families and businesses in New Mexico when they had $1 billion extra dollars. And that's not going to sit well. So I really see the first point here.
So,
yeah.
So I'm going to interrupt you real quickly
Please.
on that, because the Voices for Children, which is the yin to our yang, they are the exact opposite of everything the Rio Grande Foundation stands for. They made a very strong pitch that because there is a quote unquote working families tax credit that was enhanced or expanded in HB 6, that it was overall a net tax reduction. We don't have to get into that, but could you talk about the working families tax credit as a part of HB 6 and what that actually does? And obviously, and you have your own thoughts, but from our perspective, Rio Grande Foundation, there's no need with the $1 billion surplus to go raising taxes to pay for this working families tax credit. If they really wanted it, they could have done this on their own. So talk about that issue within that, and then we'll get to your second point about this issue.
Yeah. So great question. And really, again, this was politics. They've polled their base, and they know that if they increase taxes on the rich and redistribute that money to the poor, that polls really great with their base. And that's all that was. And I've talked about the need to do some real welfare reform in this state, but to look at it, holistically, they just picked we had a 10% working families tax credit. So
what does that do though?
So what that basically means is when you file a tax return, if you have a certain income threshold, you get a rebate of some of those taxes you pay, and then and it works as a credit as well, you get more back to you. But you have to be working to get this. It's not just automatic. But after you reach a certain threshold, too much money, you phase out of it.
Okay.
And Ronald Reagan has said this is a great tax kind of welfare program because it requires work, and I agree with him. It's one of the better ones. But we just raised it from 10% to 17% because that's what we felt like doing.
Well, we as in they.
Yes.
No, I don't want you to have to take credit for policy that you disagree with.
I appreciate that. Yes, I voted no on that bill. But we have a dozen or more welfare programs, mm-hmm. and they all turn on and turn off at certain income thresholds, and we have what we call cliff effects, which is when someone earns enough money, they then fall out of a program, and they effectively then have less money. And we really need to study that so that we are encouraging people to keep climbing up and to have that self-worth that I have a job and I'm working hard and I'm climbing the ladder, instead of, if I get a raise, I'm gonna lose my Medicaid benefits. So
right. So this working families tax credit is kind of analogous, as I see it to the earned income tax credit, which is
Yes.
Washington, D.C. policy. Of course, just to be clear, this working families tax credit is a state of New Mexico policy, so it's only going to impact taxes paid to the state of New Mexico, but it would only be income taxes. There's no exemption on the gross receipts here.
That's right.
That remains a very regressive tax, I should say. All right, so I think we've covered that, and you said that people can get checks, so it is quote unquote refundable, as they say, meaning that it's not just a tax cut, it is a spending program. So when people talk about yet another tax credit, yes, the earned income tax credit is also called a tax credit, but it ultimately morphs very quickly into payments from the state of New Mexico or the federal government, depending on which program we're talking about, to people. So
that's exactly right. Okay. One of my favorite charts that highlights this, if you make adjusted gross income less than $30,000 in New Mexico, you have a negative income tax. Because of all of our programs, you get money given to you.
Right. And to an extent, I do agree with you that, yes, the EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, and Working Families Credit is better than just handing people money or even putting hoops up in front of them and then encouraging them to get a job to a point. There's some truth to that, but still, we can't say that this is just a exemption or cut on taxes. Okay, so we kind of really went into point one, political cover on the tax reform. So there was a second point about tax reform and why they did things the way they did. It's been a long time. Offhand, what is that second point about why HB 6 really looked like what it ultimately did?
So the second point is, they recognize, the Democrats that are in charge recognize that the oil and gas industry, all this money is coming from them, and that it's cyclical. And there will be a time in the near future where the price of oil goes down, and we'll see another drop, just like we did a few years ago. Right after the Richardson administration as well. And so they had a number. They needed to increase taxes by, I think it was around $150 million to the state. Was their number, and I'm not sure where they got that. But they needed that number to make sure all their spending increases, that 12% increase in the budget that I talked about earlier, that they can maintain that. So that was another big reason.
All right, so that's where kind of HB 6 went, which is all part of it's like a Matryoshka doll of conversations we're having here, because you have to kind of dive into the middle and then come out. Maybe the onion is another metaphor for it. But so now we're talking about gross receipts tax reform in 2020.
Yes.
Now, you've said that the speaker seems inclined to do, quote unquote, something. Any ideas what that something might be, or where it might be a good something, or maybe a less than good something?
So I actually was waiting for the speaker to call me after he said he was going to do gross receipts tax reform, right? Wanted me to be on his team.
Jason's by the phone waiting.
Right? And I called him. I was like, Speaker, I've been waiting for your call. And he's like, what? And I said, yeah. And, we gross receipts tax reform. And so we had a little chat, and basically I had two options in my head, right? I could, obviously he's trying to give his members cover. And I could just fight it, and because it wasn't going to be amazing, it wasn't going to be that meaningful.
This is what's coming for 2020.
Exactly.
Okay.
And just try to blow it up and try to use it in the election. Or if he's serious and he wants to do some reform, I could try to partner with him to make sure it's as good as possible for New Mexico. And so in the end, I decided to do that latter one. And I called him up, and I shared some of my thoughts of what I thought we could do. He shared some of his thoughts, and we've decided to partner up, and we're going to try to do this together.
Okay. So tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
This is better than I expected. I didn't think we were, because this has not been covered in the media so far as I know. And I know you can't maybe share all the ins and outs, but, the highlights of where you see the gross receipts tax issue going. First and foremost, is it going to be revenue neutral, or are we talking about a tax increase here?
So hold on to yourself. This might actually be a tax cut.
Okay. All right. Well, glory be. Happy Thanksgiving.
Right?
Again.
I'm hoping. We'll see. So at a high level, of course, we're still working out the details, but at a high level, we cannot do a huge reform like we had proposed in the past, House Bill 412, which got very close to passing, being a huge reset and reform. Just in an election year with a new governor, it's just politically people are not going to, have the wherewithal to vote for something that big. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at a junior version. Okay. And so it's going to do a few things. We're going to remove a few of the exemptions, deductions, and credits that are out there. That block of Swiss cheese, that's our gross receipts tax. We're going to try to melt that down a little bit. That'll generate some money that we can then use to address some of our terrible pyramiding problems with our gross receipts tax. And for those of you who may not be familiar, pyramiding is essentially every step of the commerce chain, something gets taxed in New Mexico. So when you sell the raw material to build a widget, that's taxed. When you pay for the engineering drawing to shape it into something, that's taxed. When you pay to have it manufactured into that widget shape, it's taxed. When you then assemble it into the product, that's taxed. Anyway, you get the idea. That 7% turns into 17%, depending on what industry you're in the state. Mm-hmm. And so we've been trying to address some of that pyramiding. And we're going to be looking at professional services, business-to-business professional services like accounting, bookkeeping, HR and payroll, IT services, temporary service, these things that really hurt small businesses the most. Because if you're a small business, right, you can't afford to have a on-staff accountant or attorney or payroll person. You contract that out.
Right.
And then you get the GRT penalty. You have to pay GRT. But if you're a larger business, maybe 40 employees, you can afford to have an on-staff HR payroll person or a bookkeeper, accountant, and you don't have to pay those things. So those are the things that we are hoping to remove the pyramiding gross receipts tax when it's a business-to-business transaction.
Okay. Well, hey, let's be honest. That is a significant portion of the issue for a lot of industries in New Mexico. There's a lot of small businesses, a lot of individual contractors, people who do business in New Mexico get hammered by those taxes, and they in turn have to hammer the small businesses and entrepreneurs who are potentially trying to set up shop in New Mexico. We don't know how often those folks don't even come here because they are aware that the bookkeeper is going to have a 7.875 in the case of Albuquerque tax on top of everything else that they are paying. So that's a big step. That's a really good step. So yeah, kudos.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really hopeful we can get that done. We're also looking at trying to lower the state gross receipts tax rate.
5.125 currently.
Yes. We're hoping to lower it by 0.25%, 0.025, which isn't much. But the problem is right now, because we're bringing in so much money from the oil and gas industry, every small fraction we lower the gross receipts tax is a huge hit right now.
And talk about that because, we've talked extensively about contractors and whatnot, because I think average people see that. But oil and gas, in addition to all the severance tax and all the other revenue they bring in here, they face relatively significant burdens from the gross receipts tax. So how,
that's right.
You mentioned the widget, but even more specifically, placing a pump jack out in the middle of the New Mexico desert in the Permian Basin. Talk about the tax implications of that on the gross receipts.
Yeah, so the pump, even just drilling the well, setting up a well is $10 million higher than that, and that is subject to gross receipts tax. So you can see where, the industry putting in just one well, that capital cost is a huge infusion to the state on just the gross receipts tax, and not to mention what you already mentioned, the severance tax and the other taxes that are associated with production, the leasing of the land and those payments. There's a lot of money that comes from that industry.
And it is pyramiding. It's not done that way in other states. Now, oil and gas taxes, I've done this job for 13 years, and you get into that discussion you frequently have with people on the left, and maybe you don't have these discussions, but it's something that happens in my social media feed quite often, where you hear these numbers thrown out by environmental groups that oil and gas is subsidized to the tune of so many billions of dollars, and then you actually drill into it, and it's like, well, maybe they have an exemption for some specific activity. It could be GRT, it could be something else. Gross receipts tax, not oil and gas taxes, I should say, that industry is so unique. Taxation within it is almost a black box situation where you almost, the sausage is made. We know the sausage comes out the other end of the factory. We don't know exactly how it's done, but what you're looking for almost is that your taxes in New Mexico are not too much out of line with Texas's or Alaska's or the Gulf of Mexico or other various locations where we are competing as a state. So I know that's one aspect that makes New Mexico less attractive, but we may have other taxes that are more attractive than some other states.
Yeah, and really what you're saying is it's really just important for people to understand that whenever we look at taxes, we have to look at them holistically, right? How do all of the different fees that a business pays, how do they all work together? Because when you look at anything in isolation, it could look weird, like what you said, these environmental groups saying we subsidize the oil and gas industry. Well, no, not at all. When you look holistically at their taxes and how they compare to other states, in New Mexico, we're actually near the very top of taxation of that industry. And a lot of these exemptions, they call them, are really anti-pyramiding, right? Not taxing the business inputs. And you talk to any economist, any honest tax economist on the left or the right, they will tell you it is a bad idea to tax business inputs. And that's what pyramiding is. It's taxing business inputs. And that just causes distortion in the economy. It makes for challenges in competitiveness. And it is a way to hide taxation, quite honestly, that the final cost of the item has a lot of taxes rolled into it that you didn't see.
Yeah. So when, say, Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard talks about being more like Texas in our taxation of oil and gas, which she wanted to increase our severance tax 5%, 5 percentage points, I should say. There are other aspects of the oil and gas industry that are much different, including the gross receipts tax. And these are very complicated. I don't expect even the listeners to this podcast. Heck, I run Rio Grande Foundation. I know more about this. I'm in the 0.01% in terms of knowledge about our tax situation here in New Mexico, and I don't have a grasp on all these particular issues. So it's very complicated, but you can't just slap a 5 percentage point tax on oil and gas on the severance and not do anything about gross receipts tax. So maybe there could be a trade-off in the future there with that industry or something.
That's right. You've got to look at it holistically, not just one tax.
All right. Well, you've given me some optimism here, Jason. So I'm at least encouraged by the consideration that we may finally do something about professional services, because that is one of these very specific, like, if New Mexico has an original sin in tax policy, it's the gross receipts tax. And that professional services component, to me, is really the nub of the issue with the gross receipts. There's a lot of business inputs that still are taxed, but there's a lot of business inputs that have been pulled out over the years, for better or for worse, that make us a little bit more sales tax-ish and less gross receipt-like in our taxation.
That's right. And the what I really like about addressing the business-to-business professional services is this is going to impact every single business in the state of New Mexico, right? We're not picking our favorite, business here. We're not picking winners and losers. It's going to benefit everyone. And the cost of doing that, we're estimating that would be about $100 million. Do you remember how much we're giving to Hollywood right now?
More than that.
Yeah, $165 million when you include Netflix and NBC Universal. And so to me, it's a travesty that we're giving away $165 million to out-of-state corporations. I mean, this is the very, very definition of corporate welfare. And can we not then, while we're in this period of plenty, help out every single mom and pop business in New Mexico?
All right. Well, that is a good place to leave that discussion. Some optimism on the gross receipts tax. Now, we've got a lot of other issues that are staring us in the face coming in 2020. Not nearly as fun and exciting, but I'm going to throw out another tax issue because you're a tax guy. That's kind of your bailiwick. Is another group, a think tank. Fred Nathan was on our podcast a few weeks ago talking about Social Security taxes and how New Mexico should consider eliminating that particular tax. I think $71 million annually. So, it's a pretty low number overall, but it's something that if you start cutting taxes, you want to at least get an idea of where the money's all coming from. What do you think the chances are for that reform or other reforms? He's got a 3-part plan, kind of handicap that situation. Tell us what you think of that particular legislation as well.
Yeah, so I've talked with Fred, and I've seen similar proposals in the past. One is to exempt veteran retirement income from tax. We've seen also veteran property tax. If you're disabled, I don't think you pay property tax, but any veteran. And they have great arguments that this will attract veterans who usually set up small businesses and use their capital, and they've got great skills, and we need to build up a skill base in New Mexico. So I understand all the economic development arguments. Where I have some concerns is New Mexico is not a huge state, right? We've got about 2 million people, and my brother who lives in San Antonio, Texas. The greater San Antonio area has a population of 2 million people, right? So, just to put in context, we're not very big. And so you can only tax what you have. And so we just have to be very careful whenever we remove taxes on, something, that we understand that unless we cut spending, which government has not done, even under prior Republican governors.
Under Governor Martinez, now granted, she didn't have nearly the money to work with that we have now, but Susana Martinez did a pretty good job of trying to keep a lid on spending.
Yeah, she held the line, I'll say. And again, some of this wasn't, the legislature is the one that puts the budget together, right? Mm-hmm. So she didn't have a lot of control over that.
Yeah, it's either an up or down.
Yeah. But just look at the history of the state. The budget is always growing. And so
crescit undo,
right?
My Latin stinks, but it's the state motto. Grows as it goes is essentially the translation.
Right? Yeah, grows as it goes. So you see the binds that I'm in, right? If spending is continuing to go up and we cut taxes somewhere, that means the rest of us are going to have to pay more than our fair share, which is what's going on right now with small businesses and gross receipts tax. And you're going to see it with, pretty soon the few of us that are still working in the state that aren't on Medicaid are going to be the only ones paying tax. Mm-hmm. And so you just have to balance that. Good tax policy is that you tax everything, broad base, mm-hmm. but at a very low rate. So that's ideally where we'd like to be. And you can see how this kind of pushes against that.
Yeah, I think we're largely in the same boat on that one. The gross receipts tax reform, that is a critical component of reforming our economy, addressing an issue that sets us apart in a very bad way from our neighbors and, quite frankly, every other state in the country just about.
That's right.
Whereas the Social Security tax issue is something that, I'm a good libertarian free marketeer. I'm all for cutting any tax that we can cut, but is that the highest priority? I get why people who are on Social Security or military pensions. And I think the military pension one is a little more nuanced because I look at the numbers game in New Mexico when it comes to voters. And if you can look at voting blocks that are more on the conservative side, ex-military is probably one of those. And I hate to give away, I'm sure Brian Egolf is listening to this podcast. And,
I'm sure.
He's saying, well, we're not going to let those military guys get away because that'll change the dynamic. It's kind of like the reverse of the film subsidy situation. That program is a boon to the Democrats because it imports union dues paying, generally leftist sorts from California. So it's a whammy for conservatives electorally. All right. Well, I didn't want to overdo it on that particular topic, and we're getting into time where we want to talk some additional turkey. There's a few other issues, and if you have ones that you think are important to talk about in this session, by all means speak up. But free college is one that we've got to talk about. Now, the other one is the not free college, the miles per gallon regulations, which, as I understand it, she's not going to push or try to push through the legislature. But can you talk about kind of those two major issues and any other good or bad things that are coming down in 2020?
Yeah. So the free college one, that one is, I don't even know how to describe how perplexing that is to me. So it wasn't too long ago in the past, we had a lottery scholarship crisis. You remember we, for many years, brought in more dollars through the lottery to the scholarship than we paid out. And so it was great. 100% of tuition was covered for many, many years. My wife was on one of the first people in that first class to qualify for the lottery scholarship. It was really great, but we saturated out the gambling market here in New Mexico, and we leveled out at about $40 million of lottery scholarship. And lo and behold, the universities kept raising tuition. And part of that was the students didn't complain anymore because government was subsidizing it. They were getting a blank check from Santa Fe, so they could just raise tuition, and it would outstretch inflation by quite a bit. And we got into this situation where we couldn't pay 100% anymore. And there was talk about, well, let's use general fund to pay for the difference. And I and several others stood up adamantly opposed to that. That is not what taxpayer dollars are for paying for someone's tuition. It's for government services, roads, police, fire, teaching.
But allegedly, during the allegedly bare bones Martinez administration era, we did in fact put tens of millions of dollars towards scholarships.
Yeah. So we, so it was a compromise. It was a 2-year period only. We put about, I think it was $16 million over, so 2 years of $16 million to try to give it a soft landing. Mm-hmm. But that was going to be in perpetuity. It was going to go on forever. And we were able to cut that down in just 2 years. And now we're in a place where the lottery scholarship covers roughly 60% of tuition, but it's a dollar amount. And that's what every other state that has this situation does. They give a dollar amount. And then when the universities want to raise tuition, lo and behold, they've got pushback from students and they have to work in the free market like the rest of us. Mm-hmm. So and that was really a painful process for the legislature to go through, and the governor. It was just really painful politically. And now we're trying to introduce that exact same thing again by setting up a scholarship that will bridge that gap between what the lottery can pay and the rest of tuition. And so we're going to set ourselves up to again see tuition skyrocket. And this is going to, as we continue to try to make these payments, it's going to blow up our budget. And so it's just a complete disaster.
Yeah, I would definitely concur. We've talked a lot about the issues involving the pre-college and why it's a bad idea. The number one thing, and I have always said, is that our K-12 system is inherently broken. We need to do a better job of educating students in that system before we even talk about more money for college. And by the way, you're probably aware of this, but when you look at other states, New Mexico is really at the top 5 states in terms of higher ed funding, that we're really generous. And what are we getting for that spending already in terms of boost to our economy? And the second tangent is we're largely sending our young people out of state to find better jobs in Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, et cetera, et cetera. What is going to cause these young people to stay around New Mexico and ultimately pay some of those taxes when we give them the free college. So if you want to talk about the K-12 system and or the ultimate student outcomes in terms of their moving out of state, any thoughts on this?
So I'm trying to distill this all into something, that's savory, but all these thoughts. But, I grew up in Rio Rancho. I went to Cibola High School. I then went to New Mexico Tech for my undergrad. I did my master's at Purdue and then finished my PhD at UNM while working at Sandia National Labs. All my degrees are in chemical engineering. And
Jason's smart.
No, thank you. But I really felt like if you were motivated and you worked hard, you could get the education you need to really succeed. When I went to Purdue, I was surrounded by a bunch of kids in my class from Ivy League schools. And I did not feel one bit disadvantaged compared to them. I had just as good an education as they had coming from New Mexico Tech.
New Mexico Tech is, I would say, it's a far and away the best school in New Mexico from a higher ed perspective.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to say we don't have problems, because we do, right? I have 4 kids. They're all in Rio Rancho Public Schools, which is one of the top districts. But there are still challenges. Families, culture, I think is probably our biggest real problem here. And how do you change a culture? That's something you can't legislate. And we shouldn't try to legislate.
It helps to have institutions. And this is something that I, at the Rio Grande Foundation, I have become a more realistic person about, the impact of policy relating to culture. And I don't think policy can transform culture, but policy can either reinforce the best aspects of culture or reinforce the worst aspects. And in New Mexico, quite frankly, our policy climate reinforces many of the worst aspects of New Mexico.
That's exactly right. I totally agree with you on that. So that's exactly right.
So yeah, we could beat that one into a dead horse as well. Jason and I could talk for forever, but we'll keep this going here. And I guess, as a legislator, what's your take on this 52 mile a gallon thing, and specifically the fact that the governor at least said, and she doesn't release a detailed policy plan. She puts out a press release and asserts, I'm going to do this through the Environmental Improvement Board. So take it from there.
Yeah, it just blew my mind when I heard that she said that she's going to mandate 52 miles per gallon.
By 2022.
Yes.
Her reelection year, which I'm almost excited about if she does it.
Right? Yeah, when you look at New Mexico, right, we like our trucks, right?
Hey, Elon Musk just unveiled the e-truck or the Cybertruck. We're all going to be driving these ugly, stealth fighter looking trucks around.
Yeah, it's shocking, right? And we're all going to be able to afford that, right? Oh no, the oil and gas industry is going to pay for it for us.
Don't give them any ideas, Jason.
I'm sorry. Strike that from the record. Yeah, and then we're going to be completely renewable energy, green energy by, what was it, 2040? These are moves that will just destroy our economy and hurt families the most. And so I just don't, I can't even fathom why we're even talking about these things. And we have so many other problems in New Mexico that we could be exerting our attention trying to fix, like, I don't know, crime in Albuquerque. Are we really worried about my car getting 30, when I get 31 miles per gallon, does it really need to be 52 when we've got 72 murders in Albuquerque this year, when this constitutional amendment was passed that, snowed us all over, and we thought we were going to be keeping thugs behind bars, but instead we're letting them all out at record numbers. There's a lot of other important things we should be worrying about.
No doubt about it. Well, thank you, Jason, for your service in Santa Fe. I know it is a frustrating challenge for anyone like myself and yourself that tries to deal with rational public policy. Hopefully we can get some victories here in the 2020 session now that the party is maybe not over, but at least the initial euphoria of the party is over, as we saw in 2019, which the progressives got their way on everything. And hopefully we can get some actual common sense policies done given the once in a state's history opportunity we were really presented with the oil and gas revenue. So thanks for coming into Tipping Point, New Mexico, Jason, and good luck in Santa Fe in 2020.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoy all you do, Paul, for us in the Rio Grande Foundation, being our anti-Voices for Children and being a free market think tank. I and many others are very grateful for what you do. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.